Хорошо, 3, 2, 1, good morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, wherever you are, and for some ungodly reason you still have the boredom to watch these shows. I'm once again in Sibiu doing the 7th edition of the occasional podcast. As always, Miguel is alongside me. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for coming to this show. This time we did it differently than the previous 6 editions. This time we allowed our gracious donors to decide the topics of conversation. No promises that we'll try to stick to them. All right, last time we did this in this format was November 2022.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and we called it then Catching Up with the Wars. And we discussed quite a bit about the war in Ukraine and the cultural wars. Since then, quite a few things have happened in Ukraine. At that point, the Kharkiv counteroffensive was about to begin.
Yes.
In the meantime, it had, of course, fully completed, as evidenced by this footage from Kharkiv that I've taken myself 2 weeks ago. So it was basically a success. In the meantime, there was, of course, the readily media hyped up summer counteroffensive by ZSU, by Ukraine, and it took forever until it started. If you looked at it specifically from the if you looked at it specifically from the media's perspective, although of course we both know that in reality things were a bit more complex than that. Nevertheless, it's somewhere in the middle of September 2023 when we're taping this, so it's a fair question: is the counteroffensive a failure?
Depends on what you define as failure. In the eyes, and it depends on from whose perspective. If you're talking about the media, then if you define the counteroffensive by what the media was hyping it up to be, then it was a complete and total absolute failure. If you count it by what the ZSU was trying to accomplish, there were some things that were overly optimistic about the counteroffensive. Let's be real. I'm not here to spread Ukrainian propaganda. I'm here to actually fucking support the country. So we have to face reality a bit and realize that this was not going to be some kind of blitzkrieg all the way to Paris.
It certainly doesn't resemble the Kharkiv counteroffensive.
This is not the crossing of the Ardennes. This is something a lot more complicated than that. There are a series of defenses that were mounted from the Russian side, all the way from the Volhodar front, all the way down to Zaporizhia. This was not going to be easy, but the number of honks accomplished by the Russians has definitely done half the job for Ukraine in the counteroffensive. When it comes to the more realistic goals that they set, they're basically on point. This was not a counteroffensive about taking territory. It never was. There were hopes about it, and because of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, a lot of people had expectations that a large amount of territory would be taken again. But one thing happens in war that a lot of people don't account for. The other side is also thinking about what could possibly happen to them. And the Russians predictably grew about 2 or 3 IQ points, and that was enough for them to set up proper defenses. The casualty ratio is a lot more improved since Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, it was quite a bit of a grind fest. I know from, well, let's put it this way, sources that nobody was very happy with how many people were dying on the front in Bakhmut, on either side. And one of the things that we have to be happy about with the current state of the counteroffensive is that the casualty ratio has now come down to a level that is a lot more worrying for the Russians and a lot less of a concern for Ukraine. And the new equipment, the logistics lines that were disrupted, as I predicted in November would happen, this was more of a concentration during that period in time. And the amount to which the Russian logistics has become fucked over that period cannot be understated. I think the fact that people were expecting this massive swoop in territory led to a lot of fatigue. with regards to the counteroffensive. I don't know. It's a complicated answer. It always is a complicated answer. I mean, if you want an easy answer, you go to the news. you want the full geopolitical rundown of everything. It's different. I mean, now we have Turkey being this ticking time bomb, you know, that Russia has to worry about, and Turkey doesn't even have to put a single boot on the ground. It already has boots on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yes, although Turkey does have its the Turkish Navy is patrolling the Black Sea now.
That is something that I did not actually expect. I did not expect Turkey to do that. Because that would, in Putin's eyes, it's a breaking of an agreement that they had. In Turkey's eyes, well, the agreement expired, like you said in the conversation that we had prior, right? That is Turkey basically saying that the relationship with Russia does not matter anymore.
Or at least for the time being, because, you know, depends on what long enough timeline you're thinking. But yes, Erdogan also doesn't have any political concerns as of right now.
Well, with regards to this war, he doesn't.
Yeah, and as opposed to last year, Erdogan no longer has any political concerns. The elections have passed. He narrowly got re-elected, but he got re-elected, so no more political concerns for the time being, which of course creates enough tension with Russia. But at the same time, is Turkey's role really that important outside of the very disputed topic of export of food? Because the media has focused quite a lot about that, about the export routes of Ukrainian grain, which I understand, it's a relevant topic, but is Turkey's involvement even deeper than that in the war? Of course, no. Bayraktar notwithstanding.
Not that I would know of. And from what I can say, to my knowledge, the current status quo is very satisfactory to Ukraine at the moment. I mean, I know that the Putinists will say, well, you only took this much territory. You know, there's these maps now showing this tiny amount of territory. But again, it's not about territory. The most satisfying conclusion at this moment is the fact that Russia's logistics lines, and I'm not talking about logistics to get winter coats and stuff like that. We're far beyond that. I mean, the Russians don't even have those. But it's not even about that. It's about the fact that even the men to replace the fallen have trouble getting to the front.
Yes, and also increasingly becomes now. Of course, Ukraine still doesn't have a way to do aerial assaults for now, but once it will have it, and it will, it's a matter of time at the end of the day. Russia cannot really defend. It's definitely not Crimea. I mean, there's fewer S-400 systems to defend the rock than there were 2 months ago. Much to everyone's surprise. So yeah, and even if they could fire those, refilling the ammunition for them, it's going to be problematic.
They have to cross the Kerch Bridge.
Yeah, and crossing it with heavy ammunition turns out to be quite difficult. The strike last year turned out to be quite good.
It also damaged whatever is left of the bridge's load-bearing capacity. That's a problem. If you look at the bridge and what is crossing it, they're not crossing it with T-72s. They're not. They're just sending trucks at the moment. So reinforcing that area is going to be very difficult. And right now, the more difficult you make things to reinforce, the more you soften the front line. It doesn't matter how many defenses you have mounted, if those defenses cannot be manned.
Yeah.
And manned with people who have ammunition. That's the other thing. And
that turns out to be difficult. Nevertheless, there was, I forget his name, but there was one relatively credible military analyst from the West, American I think, who said that there's basically another 30 to 40 days, well that was 10 days ago, so another 30 days let's say, of decent weather to continue to push, and then there's the physical limit of the weather. Will Ukraine continue to push, considering what you are saying, that the strategy is more like to disrupt the logistics and just soften the front line by not having it manned?
Let's go big picture here and repeat something that we discussed earlier prior to this conversation. This is not a weekend war. It never was going to be a weekend war. The Russians thought it was going to be a weekend war, 72 hours to Kiev. And as it is right now, both forces, being bogged down as they are probably going to try to continue the attritional approach. The Russians are in a disadvantage right now, but it looks like they might try some strategies to mitigate that. Some of the new mandates, for example, including people who are oligophrenic and schizophrenic in the front line, is going to help, but they're going to need more than that. They're going to need to not just send the crazies, but send people who are actually competent. And I think that they still have a lot of manpower left in that particular area. So if they make another draft
round of mobilization.
Yeah, another round of mobilization for the special operation. They're certainly going to make Ukraine's day very hard. And Ukraine, on the other hand, is not really, it is very tepid about the idea of pushing anywhere. And going back to the subject that the question that you were asking right now, I don't think that any kind of very massive winter movements are possible, considering, first of all, that you still have to integrate the new equipment and all of the new doctrine that the soldiers that are coming in the 10th, for example, you still have to integrate that into the rest of the army's operations. And that takes time. Okay, so it took time to train them, but it also takes time for them to actually, have the ability to make a push.
Yeah, that's another aspect that the media really didn't talk about, regardless of whether it's Russian leaning or Ukrainian leaning. These kinds of details, how long it takes to integrate, and because Ukraine is also in real time changing its doctrine.
Yeah, so this war has always been, at least from the Pentagon's perspective, and I actually do trust the Pentagon in this particular regard. I don't think that I do think that the Pentagon is right in saying that this war could last even a decade. And considering that you have to think with long-term strategies, you can't just run and do something stupid. You have to, considering how limited Ukraine's manpower still is to this day, you have to treat it very preciously, and that's exactly what they've been doing throughout this counteroffensive. The siege of Bakhmut, as bravely as the soldiers fought, was not exactly in Ukraine's best interest. I don't think that holding on to Bakhmut was a terrific strategy, let's put it that way. And I think they're kind of learning a lesson from that. At this moment, there's still a lot of optimism. I believe that there's a lot to be gained at the moment, but it's slow. It's always going to be very slow in these kinds of engagements.
You said a decade, but we're just a few months away from the war turning a decade since it started, if we count the start of the war.
Well, we're counting it from 2022, at least from the Pentagon's perspective, right?
Right.
They counted from 2022. Us counting it from 2014, yeah, that's April, was it?
Yeah.
April, yeah.
April
2014. So we're talking, about a decade at this point. But no true effort. I mean, the reason why people counted from 2022 is because no real, large-scale invasion efforts were made on either side in 2014. It was just 2022, in February the 24th, that the real large-scale fighting started. So that's when it became a proper, European war.
Right. On the other hand, it probably is worth mentioning, because it is public information that, at least it's public information if you read the news from this area of the world. If you read the Romanian or the Polish news, it's clear, although you don't hear that on CNN. For instance, the training of F-16 pilots or the training on use on all sorts of longer range weapons, in fact, did start in January or February 2023. So when CNN says now that it will take time to train, it's already way past that phase. So are we seeing in the Ukrainian war the same tactic, the same communication strategy that we're seeing in the rest of Eastern Europe, where we estimate things a lot more in public than the reality? Because we were discussing in a previous episode that that's exactly what most of Eastern Europe is doing these days. It will say, yeah, we're going to do this, it's going to take 3 years, and 1 year and a half later it's already a finished project. It seems to the same thing seems to be applied to the Ukrainian war as well, at least on the Ukrainian side.
Well, you want to temper your expectations, and I think the way that the counteroffensive was hyped up, for example, was creating expectations that just weren't realistic. And that was mostly the West. That wasn't, Ukraine saying that we're going to be at Crimea. I mean, that was just a little bit of memeing here and there, but they never took it seriously. But there were reports. I mean, I think even, if you went on channels on YouTube, they were saying, you're going to take, they're going to take Crimea by next month or something like that. It's just, what the fuck are you even talking about?
Yeah, that would have been unrealistic, although of course it would have been great if it were possible.
Well, considering how much the Russian army has proficiency at honking, it wouldn't be beyond belief. But
it was definitely unrealistic.
Yes.
Right. So what you're saying is everyone should temper their expectations. This is going to take a while. It will work out, but it will not work out tomorrow or in a month or in 2.
Yeah.
Right. Fair enough.
I mean, there were counteroffensives in World War II. I hate to use this analogy, but it's a very recent, in the grand scheme of things, analogy. And there were counteroffensives in World War I and World War II that took years. That took years. So the fact that we're having this expectation that the counteroffensive from Ukraine is going to take a few months is just I mean, the people have been digging trenches. Okay, we're getting back to this World War I style of fighting in some areas, like Avdiivka and Bilohorivka and Bakhmut.
And recently liberated Ardiivka, which is the same thing. It was just chock full of trenches.
Yes.
It surprised even the ZSU officers who came in to liberate the villages. Like, Jesus Christ, that many?
Yeah. Yeah. And in that particular offensive, they just killed the shit out of everybody until there was nobody left and just walked in. That it was that brutal. And this is the kind of war we're talking about. So you can't expect, these kinds of, like when the Cossacks were fighting the Ottomans, you don't have these kinds of things where people are charging in set piece battles. This is not medieval history. This is current day. And apparently current year is 1917. So
it seems, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but it seems to me that this style of fighting is mostly forced by Russia.
Not really. It's forced by geography. I mean,
Well,
you have
too.
most of these places where the trenches were dug is because of the marshland, and it's very fucking muddy. And there, what could you do? You just charge in with tanks. You can't do a blitzkrieg there. It's impossible. Even Hitler couldn't do it.
Right. Fair enough. Since we were mentioning earlier about saying things that it's going to take several years and then halfway down the period it's already over, we've seen the similar thing during the 3 Seas Initiative Summit, which I know you followed on and off when you could. And it was pretty much the same thing. In 2018, it was announced that we're going to start working on Rail to Sea, the previous summit in Bucharest, which is supposed to connect Gdansk to Constanța. And then, if we can manage it in 10 years, that would be great. 6 years into it, and it's almost over. And suddenly the announcement now was like, basically that it's almost over. And of course it will be over on time and even before the scheduled effort. Now let's discuss about connecting all of Croatia's ports to the middle of the Intermarium, and now we're already having conversations on 3SI projects of converting Ukraine rails into European gauge, European standard.
At this moment.
Yes, and this is something that you probably won't find in the media, about several dozens of kilometers already built. all built since the war started, of course in border areas. But essentially, the rest of Eastern Europe continues the same strategy that we discussed last year in the previous episode. We say one thing in public and we actually do it much faster and at a
well, it was the same thing with the F-16s. You know, the airport near me had F-16s training about 7 or 8 months before they even announced that they were going to train Ukrainians. And that's why when they said they were going to train them, about 2 months later they already sent them. So it's well, there's a couple of other details that I'd like to discuss, but I can't. But you know, there's a reason that we're not hearing fighter jets all the time here.
Yeah, because they all moved next to Cluj in Competence, which is public information now. But before that, yes, they were stretched in other places.
Yeah, so it's the same idea that you know, we're gonna do this and give it some time, and then you complete it faster. That's been the going strategy to kind of reroute European attention away from what Eastern Europe is planning or what Eastern Europe is doing. Even Eastern Europeans don't really know, like, you know, the average Joe doesn't really know what the hell is going on with this particular.
Too many of our fellow citizens are still in the 1999 mentality, that nothing is happening.
I don't think that's a bad thing, because the information, the transfer of information about the progress of European projects in this part of the world needs to be kept a little bit under wraps, in my opinion.
Why?
Because there was, for example, there was a journalist. I don't think I can say the publication, but anyway, a journalist from a German publication that came here, and he was going to report on ammunition's manufacturing and development and everything else, and all of a sudden he was shocked to see that we are actually producing 4 times the ammunition we're officially reporting. And a lot of that ammunition is not going to Ukraine. And they're keeping it. And why? And oh my God, what does that mean? Oh shit, Eastern Europe is actually not a fucking colony. And that's something that we'd rather wait, give it some time for Western Europe to process. You know, Western Europe lives and breathes on its ability to wield its weight on the rest of Europe. And if it suddenly discovers that it cannot, it's a bit of a reckoning.
And wouldn't that be better than to just say ducem de nas, basically just put their senses to sleep? I mean, is it really serving the interests of the Three Seas Initiative region?
Yes, it is. Because the political implications of too much of this information traveling too quickly is going to create an expectation that we are actually acting as a threat. And the truth is a lot more complicated than that, but it's partly true.
Now, we don't want to be a threat, but if need be, that's one aspect. And second aspect, if that expectation isn't there yet, that means less pressure on us to build even faster, I suppose.
Yeah, and then there's the other side of the coin, in which if you say a project will be... I do this with my clients all the time. I tell them I'm going to finish in a month and I finish in a week. Because it's always nice to create a very low expectation and then surpass it.
Yeah.
It's a very good way of doing things, instead of saying that you're going to have this project done in a month and then finish it in 5. You know, so much for Stalin's 5-year plans. You know, we've already had in this part of the world quite a bit of a nightmare from that. So there's that as well. But on the other hand, it's also the economical and military power that is building up in Eastern Europe is it's better that people don't make too much fuss about it. Because at the moment, Eastern Europe is not in a position to really contend with all of the financiers and all that stuff that is going to lobby for politicians that can make Eastern Europe a little bit more tepid. And I don't think we want that.
Oh, definitely not. So what you're saying is maiming the senses of observers is a good strategy to continue at the same pace without rustling too many jimmies.
At the moment,
once.
we're already in transition, though. That's the thing. I mean, this was a good strategy for 2010s, 2015, kind of like that. But at this moment, I think people are picking up on it a little too quickly now. It's out in the open. And I don't know if that's a bad thing. I think we would have been better off maintaining a low profile for the next 5 or 6 years. But if it has to happen now, it has to happen now. I just think that now that means that you have to make the people aware of it so that they know who to vote for.
Yeah, but I suppose the war sped the process quite a bit.
Yes.
And also the fact that with the exception, I suppose, of Slovakia, every other country in the Three Seas Initiative had already reached a point where it needed relatively visible collaboration with the other.
Poland did it very nicely. They were extremely quiet about their military buildup until it was too late. And by that time, I think last year, it was when they were saying, oh my God, Poland is this giant military power that we didn't even imagine. And
had the war not started, probably it would have taken longer for
it would have taken a bit longer, but Poland was like, yeah, no, I'm just going to rattle my dick around and just,
let's see what happens.
Yeah, and they did it and it worked. It was fine.
Yeah, that resulted in all sorts of things that were, at least in the mainstream, unimaginable.
It shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, it's a country with Germany as a neighbor.
Yeah, of course. But still, I mean, it led to things that were considered unimaginable just 3 years ago. Like, for instance, the Polish border patrol doing all of the customs and passport checking in downtown Lviv, so as for the traffic to be as little impeded as possible between the two. That would have been unimaginable in 2020 or 2021 for sure. Yeah. And not only that Ukraine would allow this, but also that Poland would afford to do this. I mean, from both sides, it would have been unimaginable, politically speaking, a few years ago.
Well, I guess they live up to the saying, jeszcze Polska nie zginęła.
Koniecznie. Speaking of Poland, the current ruling party, the ruling coalition, really, because Prawo i Sprawiedliwość is not just a party, it's a coalition, is facing elections a month from now, in October. And the only political entity growing is not Koalicja Obywatelska, the left, but Konfederacja, which bills itself as further to the right of the Law and Justice Party. And the only reason we are concerned about that is because Konfederacja sometimes coughs too much in Cyrillic, because other than that, they generally do have a point. How do you see the political evolution over there?
I think they're going to just work together to some extent. I mean, that's what happens in...
Albeit unofficially, yeah.
Parliamentary republics. But I think even though PIS is losing ground, I don't think it's losing enough or quickly enough to actually really be a concern at this moment. I mean, it's not like the political situation of Hungary, which is very tenuous at the moment, and I'm not sure if how long Orban's viability is going to be.
We'll get to Hungary soon. So what you're saying is that you're thinking of another 4 years of Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in power, mostly more of the same, especially more of the same geopolitics, which tend to be quite advantageous for our region.
Yeah, I would be very surprised if they encountered some kind of massive catastrophe.
Right.
At this moment.
Right. Speaking of Hungary, the data is in. Ukraine economic growth plus 2.4% in the first 6 months of 2023.
I wouldn't trust that number too much.
Hungary economic growth minus 2.4%.
That I trust.
For the
that I definitely.
6 months.
I'm surprised that's small.
Really. I mean, how would that be? How is that even possible?
I know. The better question is, how did it take so long to happen? Because Hungary has always been managing its economy in a very boneheaded way. They've been entrenching on their smaller businesses and everything else. I mean, you have no foundation upon which your business class can actually emerge. And they just doubled down on it after that, and then started some pro-natalist garbage policies that they would work in any other context, but in this context is like, well, thank you, but there's bigger problems.
Right.
Right?
So you're saying you don't trust Ukraine's economic numbers?
I don't. I think that Ukraine may have experienced a much more severe contraction last year, which led to a little bit of a rebound this year. But I wouldn't say that these numbers are any kind of solid message about how Ukraine's economy is doing.
No, for sure.
Because I don't really, all of my love to Ukrainians and Ukraine, but I really don't believe that your country is doing extraordinarily well at the moment. I think that there's not much politically that you can do because there's a fucking war in your country, in the country, but at least it didn't have as devastating an effect on the economy as we thought it would. That's one thing I could say. And the fact that a lot of the liberalization that is happening during the war is also helping with, you can't even define contraband in that country anymore. It's so free in a particular sense.
Yeah, that's an aspect that I haven't heard anyone dwelling a little enough on it. So let's dwell a bit on that. Whenever there's a war, countries, states tend to tighten the control over the economy. Ukraine is one of the few examples, at least in the last 200 years, that did the opposite. It cut more on taxes, it cut more on bureaucracy.
And it controlled what is targeted. Very surgical. That's the thing, right? And this was something America did to some extent in the Gulf War as well. That's why, the trillions and trillions of dollars that were being expended in the war didn't have that bad of an effect on the United States economy. And it's not just because it's a big economy, the largest in the world, but also because of the fact that most of the really severe regulations in the business environment were done in a very, very targeted fashion. And this is something Ukraine kind of took a page out of. It's, okay, we're going to enter a war, and this time this war is where your own country is being invaded, which is much more different than the Gulf War scenario. And in that case, it's even more necessary to ensure that life can continue for the average citizen. I mean, that was one big thing in the Ukrainian economic policy, is that you have to make sure that life can keep going, because when people get locked down, they lose their morale. I mean, I think we saw that about 3 years ago, Your morale goes to shit. And you don't want the people with low morale in the middle of a war. So, and I think that partially may explain why all the COVID measures started to be, just brushed off when the war started over here, and
they would have been over here
eventually. Yes, but I think it happened a little quicker as the war started.
No, I disagree. I mean, it was already officially announced 3 weeks before the war started that by March 8th
in Romania.
Yes, in Romania.
But
the rest of Europe.
Yeah, the rest of Europe also started to.
Yeah.
And that's why I also still continue to advocate that Putin should be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for, curing COVID.
Although, to be fair, all information seems to indicate that he's still afraid of COVID himself. Wouldn't be totally...
I believe there are things he should be much more afraid of, half of which I can't even talk about. But, but the fear of COVID, I kind of understand it. The man is very old.
By Russia standards, he is very old.
He's extremely old by Russian standards.
There's so many of our friends who don't seem to understand either Russia or Ukraine, seem to forget that the median life expectancy for a man in Russia is like 56. So Putin being 70, he's old. So there's that. You can't get whole Mitch McConnells in Russia, let's put it this way. I mean, Zhirinovsky also died like 72 or something.
Yeah. No, I don't know anybody in the Duma any older than 60.
Yeah, there are
There are a
few
few,
older than 60,
but not that I-
but not many over the 75, that's for sure. So there's that. Yeah, let's talk about Russia as well. I mean, at the end of the day, the Three Seas Initiative, all of these collaborations that we're doing in the Intermarium region are, whether we like to admit it or not, measures to protect ourselves from, well, Germany and Russia. How about Russia? I mean, since we taped the previous episode, there was...
I don't think anybody really takes Russia seriously at this point.
No,
As a threat.
but maybe not. I don't know. Depends on who you ask. But definitely as a source of comic relief. I mean,
Oh, that one, yeah. Even Russians take Russia as a source of comic relief.
That's so true. I can't talk about why that's true, but it is true. Since we taped the previous episode, we had the Prigozhin, what do we even call it? Mutiny?
Benny Hill dash.
Benny Hill dash, whatever. Yeah. And then Prigozhin allegedly died. The word goes around that the stewardess asked him if he's going to drink that tea or we really all have to die. So things have happened in Russia ever since our last conversation in front of the camera. Where is that place heading towards?
Towards not being a place.
It's already at the stage of nothing serious, just that place. So
yeah, it's what is it? There's Russia as a political entity, not as a geographical entity, because I mean I don't think you can make a crater that big. But
the ocean of dreams.
Yeah, no. Russia as a political entity, I think, may cease to exist in the next decade. Decade.
Right. So you're going with the Kirill Budanov view.
Yes.
Right.
In the next decade. I don't believe that even the Russian people have really such a strong tie that necessitates them to have a state that calls itself Russia. And you're in trouble when that happens. Because the moment somebody else can offer them something a little bit better, they go to that person.
And to be fair...
And that's what's been happening for the past, 2 decades and a half. That's exactly what's been happening. The moment that even a tiny amount of hope is offered by any other country, they just flee. They go immediately. Russia is at this moment, if not already, progressing towards being a failed state. And no matter what concessions they may pull out of Ukraine, they lost the war. They lost the war already. They could pull all the concessions. They could have all the territory they currently occupy. And when the soldiers come back home, you know what direction they have to point their guns in to come back home? Back home.
Yeah.
So, no, I think Russia is actually, the Russian government, Putin and his cronies, are probably hoping that the war lasts forever. Because that way they don't have to think about what happens.
Yeah, they don't have to face the music in the post-Bellic architecture. Right.
It's not good.
Yeah, and
I don't know how else to say it. It's just not good. It's in a very poor state.
Right.
No, that's not saying that there are parts of Russia that are not doing quite well. I mean, St. Petersburg is doing okay.
Except for when things blow up here and there.
Yeah, but
it's manageable for sure at the size of the Petya metropolitan area.
And as much as people in the West like to think that the sanctions were super ultra effective, I mean, they were effective to some extent, but
depends on the field.
But you go, if you would visit Russia right now and walk in the street, go to the supermarkets, everything else, you find that everything's okay. People generally, yeah.
And
you discover a society that's functional.
Yeah, functional-ish. Then to the extent the ish part, that's probably where the Westerners are wrong about it. Russia was functional-ish before the war as well.
Yeah.
It was never really very functional. It was functional-ish. Good enough for government work, which by the way, it is a say that came from the Soviet Union. It is a say. So from that perspective, yes. I mean, it is increasingly troublesome. I mean, I was reading Ria Novost just a week ago They have fuel shortages for the autumn harvest. They don't have enough fuel to do the harvest.
To even collect their food.
Yeah, and that's quite shocking because that shouldn't be happening in Russia, but it does. So there are elements and portions of the ish part of the functioning society that where the sanctions.
Considering the types of combine harvesters that were produced in Russia, I'm not surprised they have a fuel shortage. They're extremely inefficient.
They consume too much. Yeah, that's also true. But nevertheless, the local production should be able to keep up with it, and they don't because, well, some of the sanctions definitely do have an effect. Whether that effect will be enough to disrupt enough of Russia, we'll see. But it's definitely disrupting enough of the Russian military, which I suppose was the point to begin with.
No, I believe that the way that things are happening internally in Russia is just apathy. If you're talking
which
about
is the standard in Russia?
Yeah, I mean it's always been an apathetic population since the 80s. At the very least, since the 80s, if not further back. But when you go from Gorbachev to today, there is a difference. Is that I think people are apathetic right now in Russia sufficiently to whether Russia even exists or not.
Yeah, at least Gorbachev offered some economic hope, and they still believed a Russia should exist.
Yes. And there was this wave of nationalism that came immediately after the Yeltsin years when Putin started to enter office. There was this very, let's say, positive Russia. And then it just, we just came back to status quo. So.
Yeah, that's another aspect. I mean, so many of the Western commentators analyze Russia through an exclusive Western lens, and in the sense that they presume that Russians are very similar to us. And yes, in some aspects they are, but in
Westerners also, because of the amount that they've progressed, also are very presentist when they talk about Russia.
Yes.
Is that this was, if you look back, like way back, right? The apathy is going all the way back to freaking 1480s. Back when Muscovy was on its way to becoming Russia.
When the rejects of the rejects were creating their first kingdom. But yes, I mean, apathy is such a consistent leitmotif throughout Russian history that their presentism, the Russian presentism, actually is forced to take that into account. And if you watch close enough the discussions that Solovyov and all of that clique are having whenever they don't have to convince anyone of anything, they all start with, let's not forget that a lot of our society is depolitized. So how about we start selling some of these propaganda talking points internally because it ain't working. And that's the part where Solovyov isn't wrong. Except that there's not much to do. As they say, что делать, ничего делать. I mean, there's not much that they can do. So from that perspective, but unfortunately, and this is really a conundrum, unfortunately, we cannot afford, or maybe we cannot wait it out because that will never blow up. I mean, apathy just creates more apathy. It never really blows up. But what it can do is open up the pathway for some other Prigozhin style of reform, I suppose.
Well, that's, as I said, there's more things that Putin should be worried about than COVID, and that's one of those. I mean, you've got to think that at least one of the elite, at least one, is thinking to themselves, well, if that was so easy, maybe I could do it a little better. And go all the way to the Kremlin.
Gazprom has its own PMC, Rosneft has its own PMC, Shoigu has his own PMC, Gerasimov has his own PMC. Goodness me, there's so many PMCs in Russia where PMCs are illegal.
It's like that meme with the Spider-Man that are pointing at each other.
Any one of those could blow up.
Well, that's where I'm thinking. I mean, my money is on Game of Thrones style of shit show. In 5 years or 10 years, 5 to 10, kind of like that. There's these people that are saying that it's going to happen next year or something like that.
From your mouth to God's ears, I just don't think it's realistic.
Yeah, no, I don't believe. It's really important for Westerners in particular. If there's one thing I could tell them about this region, is to temper their expectations. typically about how fast things will happen, because there hasn't been a major explosive conflict in Europe for nigh on 90 years. And
unless we count the Yugoslav wars.
but the Yugoslav wars, they were just a very long skirmish in the end. We're talking like real front lines developing between two giant nations and things like that. That didn't happen for a very long time, since the Ardennes were crossed by panzers. So first of all, that makes two things happen. First of all, they are Europeans of all stripes, Westerners, Easterners. I've seen happen is that they're constantly comparing things to World War II. They constantly go back to World War II for things like that. If you want to go to some war that's a little bit more akin to this one, go back to World War I, not World War II.
With one exception, World War I was far more civilized on civilian life than this one.
Yeah. The civilian life and civilian casualties is a little more comparable to World War II or the Yugoslav wars. Actually.
Or the Yugoslav wars.
Yugoslav wars is more appropriate. Right. Because now World War II took a real toll on civilians, very severe one. And then the second thing that happens is that because of the inexperience with these kinds of geopolitical struggles, a lot of Europeans and Americans do not have realistic expectations about what can or cannot happen. I mean, a lot of, for Americans in particular, a lot of their expectations come from the Gulf War. But the Desert Storm was, that was like, what, 48, 72, that would have been Kiev in 72 hours. That would have been.
But the difference in military might between the sides fighting was much bigger.
It wasn't just military might, but it was also strategum. It was the ability of the generals to know the battlefield well enough. And in here, let's be honest, both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, have a little bit of difficulty with strategy. Ukrainians had a strategy crisis at the very beginning of the war when the Hostomel airport was taken, and they fucked up a little bit in the first wave. Learned their lesson, went in on the second wave. Now the Russians have take that to a whole new level because they just kept on landing paratroopers in Hostomel without, without even thinking, maybe this
doesn't work.
Maybe the Hearts of Iron 4 meta doesn't work in real life,
There's also that. I mean, we're consistently joking off camera that if not for the immense level of human tragedy, the Russian-Ukrainian war would make for a great comedic series, because it's just so many honks after honks and upon other honks, in ways that it was probably true in previous wars too, but this one is the first major one that we can watch in real time.
That we're recording with these things.
I mean, imagine if we had the Twitter in World War I in the trenches, or TikTok in the trenches. I mean, that one probably had few similar honks, but we just weren't recorded in history.
Now, soldiers dancing and teabagging each other, that definitely happened in World War I.
Of course. But other things we don't know, because
we even have recorded footage of it happening.
And again, statistically, it would have been impossible not to. That's another, and that's really when you're saying that. But the expectations of Europeans and Americans have changed quite a bit, in the sense that there are no reference points.
What we don't see in Ukraine, that we did see in World War I though, and there is footage of it, is a bunch of English soldiers and German soldiers getting drunk together and switching hats. Grabbing the pickelhaube and stuff like that.
Probably this would have happened if the level of the war had remained civilized, and it would have still been a fraternal war, but it's not, so no. We were watching together a documentary made by a Russian football player who went on to interview Ukrainian football players from all over Europe, and they were trying to see whether the Russians and Ukrainians, especially Ukrainians, can forgive Russians after the war, and the consensus seems to be no, because no. And this will have a fun, civilizationally changing effect in ways that cannot
maybe
be
if
predicted.
Russia would have said oopsie after the 72-hour stint that they tried and just withdrawn after that, I think the Ukrainians would have forgiven them. That would have been like, okay, you did an oopsie. It's okay. You know, we all do it. But no, at this point, I think Ukraine's entire identity is based on fuck Russia at the moment. And that's one thing that Putin accomplished that I don't think any Ukrainian president could have accomplished as well.
To unite Ukraine
into a single country.
Yeah. The divisions in the past before the war were like the "we're not Russians" group. We're not really Russians group. We are Polish/Hungarian/ Romanian/ whatever, all of the ethnic minorities. And the 7 or 8%, actually we are Russians. Those were basically the four identity groups in Ukraine. And then the war started, and then Bucha happened, because that was a turning point in the cultural milieu of Ukraine. And it's like, no, we're the fuck Russia. And then there's the fuck Russia coalition with Georgia and
then there's fuck Russia, but we speak Russian. You know?
Yes.
Fuck Russia, but blue.
Yeah,
you know?
This is really the fascinating part. Most of the victims, especially the civilian victims of this war, are the Russian speakers of Ukraine. When I went to Bucha to take these images in May 2023, nobody spoke anything other than Russian to me without them knowing where. I mean, they assumed I'm a foreigner, but they had no idea where I was from. And now the last month I went to Kharkiv, and I don't think I've heard spontaneous Ukrainian being spoken anywhere. But at the same time, don't tell those people they're Russians, because that may cost you quite dearly. This is really also fascinating what Putin managed to accomplish. Let's liberate the Russian-speaking peoples, and they were the most affected by it. And also those who don't speak Russian are also the most...
Similar thing happened in the front at Danzig. Those Germans actually ended up resenting the regime after they were liberated. It happens a lot. That's why, wars of liberation they're very tricky. They're very fucking tricky.
It can work out, but so often they don't.
It worked out when France was liberated. It worked out because they worked together with the resistance, and well, you have that.
Yeah, but in this case, there were very few who were willing to betray in favor of Russia. They were, of
enough
course.
to form a few battalions. That is true. I mean, there was the Luhansk People's Battalion. I say was because I'm not sure it's present anymore. And then there was also the Donetsk. There are 3 battalions from Donetsk.
2 left. But
Two
yes,
left. Yeah. Okay.
But still very few compared to, I suppose, to what Russia would have expected.
I would have expected to see a gigantic force because those are very populated areas.
Yeah, compared to the pre-war population of the areas, also it's definitely underwhelming.
Yeah, I would expect to see a much bigger force of the loyalists.
So yeah, it kind of didn't work out. All right, let's cross the Atlantic Ocean a little bit and discuss the United States. It's been several enough minutes since the start of the video, so we risk less of censorship from YouTube. They're still technically we're still in pre-campaign. There hasn't, not a single primary election has taken place. So whilst the media is pumping up and down all sorts of candidates, it's really too early because not a single vote was cast in any primary. So many things can change, including a change of the frontline candidates, really. So let's discuss a little bit on the former president's legal troubles. What's your take on the indictments / allegations on Donald Trump? Can that really sink his candidacy? Do they really matter to...
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think considering how loyal his base is, I really don't think that he is going to lose candidacy. I don't say it as somebody who is optimistic or pessimistic about it. I'm just saying it as it is. I think that if Donald Trump decides to run, he will have the support that he would expect to have, even with all these indictments.
And is that strong enough for him to win the nomination?
It could be. It could be.
Because one thing everyone agrees on is that it is lower than it was in 2020. What we can't agree on is how much lower. Is it lower enough that he could lose?
Has the average red voter gotten fatigued with him or not? That's the question, right? That's a question I can't really answer very
Nobody can
adequately, because first of all, not a lot of polling has been done in this regard from polls that I trust.
Right.
And 1 second. Oh God. The problem with cigarillos. Anyway, I don't see a lot of hubbub about this. I don't see a lot of people coming forward saying, you know what, this really cuts it for me that Trump was indicted. A lot of people, and with good reason, are saying that this is just bullshit, that it's not a proper exercise of the law and whatever. I think this, much like anything else, is just political theater.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that there's any intent to really prosecute him, because I don't think that the basis upon which you can prosecute him is very strong. He said a couple of things here and there about the election. Okay, well, I can do that and not go to jail. So why he, an American citizen, can't? You know?
Right.
I don't see this as petering out into something so big. The fact that he turned himself in, on the other hand, I think that was in his favor.
Right. Why?
Because
he's showing that he still has some respect for the rule of law, but
the Democrats offered him martyrdom, and he's like, "Well, thank you," took it on a silver platter. I mean, you if you look at the people who really support him, they're buying T-shirts with his mugshot.
Right. And that is, of course, another question that we cannot answer right now, whether it's the conflict between the martyrdom theory and the American people's deference to the rule of law. Which one will win out? And that's very difficult to ascertain.
Unpredictable at the moment. I would have told you 20, 30 years ago, maybe,
that the rule of law would win, yeah.
No. I would say that the outlaw would win. American culture is the culture that admires, what was his name? The guy that robbed a bunch of trains. I mean, it's a culture of the go-getter, kind of outlaw.
Come and get it.
Yeah, that kind of guy. So if you can paint yourself that way, you have a certain appeal to American people.
Especially if you can get the bling out of it.
Yeah.
That's where probably Trump was misascertained, I guess, is that even a word? He was judged wrongly by the potential opposition.
Misunderstood.
Also misunderstood, but in the sense that they expected things to go, not just the Democrats, but also his Republican adversaries in 2016 and 2020. They expected certain things to work. Like, oh, we're gonna...
Or to matter.
Or to matter, we're gonna bury him under sex scandals. And his response, we grabbed him by the pussy and they loved it, so what? And and that ended up gaining him votes rather than losing. And he's such an atypical candidate in this perspective, atypical politician for sure. Most other politicians would have cowered in fear a long time ago from all of the BS thrown at them.
It just showed that the American political system is now governed by who has balls and who doesn't. You know,
and is that a bad thing?
No.
There's too many commentators who seem to think that that's a bad thing, and I'm not convinced. We were discussing yesterday, before we taped, obviously, about the fistfights in the Slovak parliament, in the Serbian parliament, in the Turkish parliament, and how this is actually pretty normal. To a certain extent, within some limits of civilization, yes, but to a certain extent, a little bit of might makes right is not necessarily a bad thing. And this used to be the case in the US as well, as late as, 50 years ago, 60 years ago?
Yeah.
And it still is the case in state houses.
Yes. I think that if you're going to look at America in a macrocosm, you have to understand that a good part of the population will see the martyr outlaw as and the underdog, as the primary contender. Mm-hmm. And there's a good possibility that this actually played in Trump's favor. Mm-hmm. Everything that just happened. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that because I'm hoping that Trump wins. Actually, quite the opposite. I do hope that we can actually refresh things with new blood. Mm. I think I'm getting a little bit myself fatigued a little bit with all the enthusiasm about Trump. Mm. But to his credit, the way that he played this was exactly going into his favor. Mm.
To be fair,
because he both acknowledged the rule of law and followed it, and made himself a martyr. Mm. So,
thus further strengthening the underlying message of the Trump campaign, both in 2016 and 2020, that they're not after me, they're after you. I'm just standing in the way, right? Which can be a very powerful message. Most of his adversaries underestimated the power of that kind of messaging.
Yes, but what is disappointing to me, right, is in the big picture sense, the inability to create a proper movement, mm-hmm. because this is just a cult of personality, to be mm-hmm. honest. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's people gathering around Trump to support him and supporting him, not the message. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is the emerging school of thought, I guess, on the right that. Maybe in 16 and maybe to an extent even in 2020 MAGA was about America, but now it's really all about just Trump, and that's an argument to move away from the circus, keep the message but leave the circus, at least this version of the circus. And speaking of fresh blood, let's talk a little bit about Democrats as well. There is also an emerging school of thought that perhaps both Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden should just leave us alone, because they're both in the obzisi mort type of... I mean, they're just too old, aren't they?
Yeah, and unlike the Republicans, which are somewhat bringing French blood, the form of DeSantis and the form of...
Jim Jordan
was around for a while, though.
Still significantly younger than McConnell or Trump.
He's quite fresh. Yeah. But
Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance, there are quite a few.
Yeah, unlike these people, the Democrats are basically a retirement home. And that's going to slowly erode their party, if it already isn't completely eroded, because, I mean, is this the best candidate you were able to bring up for the presidency?
The guy who shit himself in front of the Pope. I'm not joking, that's a real thing that happened. Joe Biden shat his pants in front of the Pope. And as funny as it is, and of course it is funny, don't tell me it's not, it's still at some point pity generating. I mean,
a bit, yeah.
It's verging on elderly abuse, and Joe Biden should be singing sleeping songs for his grandsons and granddaughters rather than...
The ones at least that he acknowledges.
At least the one that he acknowledges, yes. And even those that he doesn't. I mean, he would have plenty of time, no longer being president, to also take care of those that he doesn't acknowledge. There's also, of course, the alternatives that they're currently talking about, like... Kamala Harris managed to get 2% in a Democrat primary. Nobody really likes her, so this whole panic porn that she'll just replace him, not in a fair...
Even her own cabinet, if she would be a president,
wouldn't like her, and wouldn't follow her. How about Gavin Newsom? Would Gavin Newsom be... he's younger.
He's younger, he's smart. Mm-hmm. He has. He's smart enough to know that he can't be stupid in public like he is in California, because in California it works.
So?
Well,
You think so?
I think he's aware enough to understand that something that works in California is not necessarily going to work on a
Ohio,
nationwide basis.
yeah.
I actually think he's more aware of that than DeSantis. Because in his perspective, he looks at things at a national level a bit more, whereas DeSantis was a lot more focused on his backyard. So I don't like Gavin Newsom. I'm not saying this because I do. Again, I'm just opining on something that I believe is true. And I really resent the fact that we have to clarify this shit, because just because I'm speaking highly of somebody doesn't mean I necessarily like them.
Yeah. It is one of the trade-offs of the current polarization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to like somebody to speak positively of them. Well, I don't like Trump very much, but I did speak very positively of him just recently.
Yeah.
Right? Well, the same thing with Gavin Newsom. I mean, I think that Gavin Newsom has a lot of potential politically on a national level if he caters his message correctly. He can't do the same things that he does in California. That's all. And I think he's already aware of that.
The reason I'm bringing him up is because even very Democrat-friendly or even straight-up Democrat-affiliated circles have started to be pretty openly hostile to President Biden.
Yes.
Not just on, not necessarily on account of policy, although on policy as well, but specifically on, this guy is just too old. I mean, really, can't we do better? And I can't help it. I have to sympathize with those Democrats because they do have a point. They should be able to do better, even if slightly better. There's still a very strong possibility that Joe Biden will not be on the ticket in November 2024.
I don't know. Both parties are very reluctant, have been historically very reluctant to primary
An incumbent. Yeah.
Yeah. The last time this was discussed was about primarying Trump, but you know, considering the pull he had, they couldn't do that.
Yeah, but that was unrealistic. Whereas this time around is far more realistic because
it's a possibility.
Who was in the Republican Party a mainstream figure that seriously contested Trump's leadership of the party in December 2019? Nobody. Whereas this time around, their own backyard, the most mainstream part of their backyard, is contesting him and say, well, come on, Mr. Biden is just too old. So it is at least slightly more realistic. But you're right, and that speaks a little bit to, I mean, we were joking earlier that both parties seem to be on a race to commit suicide. I mean, both parties are incredibly reluctant to.
It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if they both just seppuku'd. But
what's the worst that can happen if both parties commit seppuku?
New parties. That's it.
Yeah, but would the
a
new
bunch of independents, a big Game of Thrones, and then
would the new parties necessarily be better, or?
I don't know. I don't know, but it's gonna shake something up, right? I mean, generally the tendency in the United States is that when new parties form, they start having more constitutional arguments rather than arguments based on I don't know, single issues and shit like that.
And internal tradition and
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because you're no longer operating on top of the monolith that was already founded. You're operating on a brand new platform. So that allows a lot more flexibility politically to actually move the lines a little bit more. And that would be an opportunity for a lot of operatives to actually try to get the Overton window just a little bit more this way or just a little bit more that way. That's exactly what happened when the Whigs separated into the Democrats and the Republicans.
All right. Let's say that this happens. How long would it take for?
About 2 decades.
Right.
That's about where it was historically. Always the Federalists and then the Whigs and then all the other shit.
And would that necessarily be accompanied by civil strife, as one of our donors asks?
I doubt it. Americans are too content. They're too content. They like their Funko Pops. They like their iPhones. They're too content.
That's fair. But at the same time, we've had an incredible rise, admittedly nowhere near to dangerous levels, but still an incredible rise in talk of civil strife / civil war on both ends of the
And all of it is
spectrum.
LARPing.
I believe so, but what makes people talk in these terms while at the same time not acknowledging just how stable the republic is right now? It probably was never that stable, really.
What makes them talk like this? Boredom.
They've had it too good for too long.
To an extent, and also to another extent. I mean, you can't. I can only give you the individual motivation of one particular person or another. You know, that everybody has their motivation.
Obviously.
There's like probably at least 700 reasons, of which none overlap between people. You know, because I think to a large extent, okay, I was very unfair when I said boredom. I think there are some people like Antifa, for example. They're very bored. They're bored. This is their opportunity to touch grass. They go touch grass. You know, that's what they're doing. And once in a while, they'll bring a bike lock with them and smash somebody in the face. You know, because it's fun. You're in a black bloc. You kind of get anonymous, except that guy that had the bike lock, that was a professor. But there were a whole lot of other violent incidents where you got to be anonymous. I mean, come on. It's for a young adult that has absolutely no direction and wasn't raised correctly at all. Sounds like absolute fun. And you get to have solidarity with a whole bunch of other weirdos like yourself.
So you're suddenly no longer alone.
Yeah. And you escape the mouse utopia, essentially. For the people like Proud Boys, it was just, I want to LARP and I have nobody to LARP with. Hey, look, I found some people to LARP with. What was it? For the motherfuckers in the mountains, those guys are a little more serious. Those guys are a little more serious.
Precisely because they haven't been taken seriously for too long, and that pisses them off.
Yeah, no, all the little breakaway groups in the Appalachian, I wouldn't really mess with those people. And to them, it's a lot more about country and family. It's a lot more about country and family. And especially since a lot of them are also disaffected workers that used to work in coal mines.
Yeah, and the current administration has definitely not been a good friend of that.
In the last year, kind of. But for the past 20, no, definitely not. And by current administration, I'm talking about Obama's third term.
Yeah, of course. Similarly, I suppose with the commentators is a lot of boredom, both on the far left and on the far right.
Yeah, no, like Nick Fuentes and things like that. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I count Fuentes as a far left, obviously. It's a lot of boredom, but also a lot of money. I mean, this is one trade-off that is really, I don't think it's concerning, but it's definitely worth acknowledging of social media. Now you can make money off of eyeballs, personally. Eyeballs. Yeah. So saying extreme shit online.
I thought you were talking about a new Apple product. Eyeball. I do not know why that came to my mind, but it was just...
No,
I was like, wait.
Seriously, off of views. I mean, you can make money personally, so saying fucked up or unnuanced things online can get you more money. So instead of talking about the nuances of various groups and look, here's where there is some dangers, here's the LARP, you just go and focus specifically on the LARP and make it as serious and as nuanced as possible, and that gets you personally more money. So as a result, there is an incentive.
There's also algorithms. You know, I think we underestimate just how much algorithmic compartmentalization has had an effect on what we see and how much we're exposed to it. Because even though, there's a very large contingency of left-wingers who are the developers of YouTube and things like that, The algorithm does not have politics. And the algorithm, if it sees that you're a right-winger looking for right-wing concepts and commentary and stuff like that, they'll direct you right away to Tim Pool, well, no longer, Fuentes is no longer there. Good riddance. They'll direct you to Steven Crowder, they'll direct you to Elijah Schaefer, he's no longer there either, but whatever. Yeah. So they direct you to those podcasts. And then you don't get to see people like Vosh, people like, well, Vosh is a joke even among the left. But, you know, you don't get to see the other side. And it's the same with the leftists. If they see that, you know, the algorithm sees that you're a leftist, they'll direct you to this guy, that guy, that guy, that guy. But you don't see anybody like...
Yeah, but in both cases, both for those looking for left-wing content and those looking for non-left-wing or right-wing content, they take you to the most unnuanced version of it.
Exactly.
They don't take you to a left-wing intellectual or a right-wing intellectual that discusses a bit of nuance. No, they take you to the...
Professional shouters.
Yes.
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 People who treat it like it's the WEF. You know, and you're watching wrestling. And then I think that causes a little bit of mental poison. Because... and that also radicalizes people. It entrenches them into a position without listening at all to the opposition. And I'm not saying that radicalism is a bad thing necessarily, but I think that uninformed and unnuanced forms of radicalism can really, really be damaging. I regularly listen to watch left-wing news, listen to it. I watch Russian news. I watch their TV, you know, with the exception of the time that you've been here, I've been watching Russian television every single day. In the morning, I turn on R1, you know, R1.
Россия 1.
Россия 1, I read RIA Novost.
I subscribe to RIA Novost's channel and I watch
It's an old adage that's been overplayed by Sun Tzu, but the better you know your enemy, the better you know thyself. And to an extent, having all of this allows you to understand the other side. Now, to an extent, right-wingers, I think, understand left-wingers a little better than the vice versa.
That used to be the case, but this is what concerns me.
I think it's still the case to some extent. It's just less the case than before.
Yeah.
Yes, it's less the case than before. There's been a lot of political entrenchment on the right, and that concerns me.
And it's not because the left has begun to understand us better. It's more like ours have become a little bit more like the left.
Yes.
More ignorant of the opposite position.
Yes.
Which is quite unfortunate. And our politics doesn't help either. I mean, in Europe, technically what we just said now, we admitted to committing a crime, namely to circumvent the bans on Russian propaganda and just watch it anyway. You're not supposed to watch Россия 1 from inside the Европейский Союз.
But I need to do it because I can't talk about what's going on in Russia without actually... Because I don't want what CNN tells me what's going on in Russia. Half of it is just bollocks.
Especially now, since CNN no longer has a correspondent there, so how exactly are they getting
you're
their
just
information?
speculating on what's happening in Russia instead of actually, you know, paying attention to it. And I can't go to Russia.
Yeah, I can't either.
Yeah, we're kind of, you know, verboten from going there at this moment. I got a nice little letter saying that I can't go. And so my only way of actually finding out, you know, what's going on the ground is at least having a look at whatever Russians are looking at.
That, and also at a short trip through the Russian social media. Same thing, you're not supposed to be using Russian social media inside the Европейский Союз. And I'm like, well, how exactly am I going to find out what Russian people are thinking if I'm not in the same chat rooms where they are and they express themselves?
Yeah, I'm on their Telegram channels. I'm in their pro, you know, I'm in their Slava Z kind of shit, you know, these other channels that start to praise Russia and stuff like that. I want to see what they're saying about what's going on in the war in the front line and everything else and all the copium that they're spitting out. And as much of a waste of time as it is, if you do want to interest yourself in politics, this is the point, right, that I'm trying to make. You cannot entrench yourself just with people that agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
You have to mix yourself within, blend inside of groups that want you dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I started doing politics, that is to say, when I first got one politician fired for being excessively left-wing in public, that was more than 20 years ago. At that time, the standard was that a political operative is to be able to very convincingly argue the opposite of what he believes.
Yes.
That was the standard. And today there are so many relatively experienced already political operatives who can't.
There's one guy who's a little bit to the left that does this pretty well. Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually damn good at it.
Yes.
And I have a lot of respect for him because he can hold intellectual positions that are completely diametrically opposed to what he believes in, and convincingly make arguments for it.
Yeah.
That means that the more that he knows already the opposition, that means that he's very difficult to trounce in a debate because of that. That also is why after all of the debate bro bullshit on the internet started to die, he still stayed relevant because he actually listened to the other side.
Yeah, so I guess on the right we could point out to Chris Rufo. I mean, he really understands the intellectual machinations and the institutional machinations of the opposition. So when he was put in the position to recreate it for the non-left...
How did Lenin achieve power?
Yes, same thing, yes. We don't have that much anymore. And it used to be the case that for every destiny there were 10 or 15 Chris Rufos. But now it's more like for every destiny there's like 2 Chris Rufos. I mean, the ratio has gone down quite a bit, which I suppose...
It's like entropy, a return to equilibrium.
Yeah, which I suppose ties into our 3-day-long theme before we started filming this episode, which is the competency crisis. Every single field, including politics, seems to be going through a severe competency crisis.
I think IT has it harder than every other field, but...
True, but it's noticeable everywhere. I mean, we were discussing earlier, maybe we should throw that into this episode as well. Who are going to have the next president here in Romania? I mean, we gossiped about Poland and Hungary. How about Romania? Who are going to have president?
I think ChatGPT can make a better president than...
than the current wardrobe. I mean, yes. I mean, we are in Sibiu. That's a wardrobe. There's your president right now. So, I mean, it is a competency crisis in so many ways, in so many fields. But you're right. IT probably has it the worst at this point, which is what makes techno-optimism as inherently funny. Because with the competency crisis, let's put technology everywhere. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, no, there's the people who knew what they were doing are either senile or dead in politics for the most part. And the last time we had a competency crisis like that was 1913, 1912, kind of like that, where you had Friedrich Wilhelm and you had Nikolai on two opposite sides. These are two cousins of one another. You had the Hohenzollern family and then this guy, and they still ended up at war. How? It takes a very special type of boneheadedness to allow something like that to happen. And it was because there were so many opportunities for it not to happen. There was the diplomat that was sent to go to Serbia and negotiate terms from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was denied. Okay, fine, and then he said, okay, well, maybe we can remove that clause that makes that obligates them to introduce the police from the Habsburgs into Serbia, right? Oh no, they rejected that. Okay, but now you made a perfect political move. It was perfectly acceptable, but you waited too long because you were waiting for the German king to come back from vacation. How do you fuck up that bad? How do you fuck up that bad? And then it's just so many opportunities for the war to be stopped, and not one of them. It's almost like a drama. You know, like a Greek drama, like a Greek tragedy.
Or a Final Destination episode.
Exactly. It's like let's use a more modern context. Yeah, like one of those movies. Yes. It's just everything. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine of fuck ups, you know. And
if anything, that can be applied to the Ukraine war too. Between 2008 and 2014, Russia could have had everything, and then they decided not to.
yeah, but that's Russia being Russia.
True. True.
The competency crisis is a bit more severe than that, and right now I see that we're going to enter another era, at least in the Anglosphere, of extreme boneheadedness.
But is that translated in other places too?
I don't think so.
Right.
I really don't think, for example, that France has a severe competency crisis.
Or India.
In politics. Or India, yeah.
I
dislike Modi, but he is doing a great job there.
Yeah, India has made tremendous political progress and economic progress over the last 6 years in ways that would have been unimaginable. And of course, it's not entirely Modi's merit, but it is the merit of the Indian elite who decided 15 years ago that we're going to just all work towards this goal and grow up in 15 years as others would have grown in 50.
And I don't think Romania's competency crisis is that severe.
Right.
I think Hungary's is pretty severe. I think that...
I find it hard to disagree.
Yeah, and I think Turkey has a pretty severe competency crisis.
You think Kılıçdaroğlu and CHP would be worse than Erdogan? And
I don't think they'll be worse. I just think that what comes after is not predictable. I think that
which is terrifying for Turkey because the Ottoman tradition tends to be very predictable. Well, what comes next used to be very predictable. Yeah.
Yes. I don't, because you have to factor in the fact that although Erdogan is Erdogan, right? Let's eliminate all of the smjork about him and all that other stuff that I also take part in. But at the very least, he understands where the heel and the toes are in his country. I don't think any other politician besides him really has that type of understanding. And you're starting to have a degradation of that. And it's going to continue to happen over time. With Romania, I don't think so. I think there's sufficient comeuppance to the established order coming soon. I think so.
Right. So you're a bit more optimistic on the...
I am pretty optimistic about Romania's future. Yes.
Fair enough.
Its political future.
Fair enough. Let's get back to the US. Let's talk about DeSantis' campaign. Ron DeSantis announced...
Does he have a campaign?
Fair. That's absolutely fair.
Because he was trying to announce it on Twitter.
Yes. And, last episode, which was 10 months ago, I did speculate, and you said that you don't want him to run because you don't want to lose the governor of your home state.
I'm still of that
your
opinion.
State of origin. And I was saying then, I suppose he will try to run nationally. And then months have passed. I was, I think, in Ukraine when he announced on Twitter, yes. At that time, it was still called Twitter. Because
and it was buffering.
Yes.
It was just... It was just the buffer of the.
Yeah, I was quite annoyed that I had forgotten to take my clown nose with me because I would have wanted to record a little clip about his campaign from Maidan Niezależność and with the clown nose. But anyway, honks notwithstanding, at least in theory, there's still a DeSantis campaign. There's still DeSantis paid shills out there. So what do Floridians, first of all, think about that? Are they happy? Did they consider that?
I haven't been to Florida in 15 years. That's a hard question to answer.
But you've been keeping contact consistently
of course.
with...
I think a lot of the voter base that was there before is still going to be there. I don't think the Floridians have lost faith in DeSantis at all.
Right.
And why would you? It really would confound me to an infinite degree to to see if to see that Florida has lost faith in him.
The fear was that he would neglect his duties as governor as he's campaigning nationally. But to be fair, that fear did not materialize.
No.
Florida has had some natural disasters, whatever other problems, and DeSantis was there.
Pretty much.
Yeah, it kind of
handled it pretty well.
Yeah.
No, I think Floridians are just as enthusiastic about DeSantis as they were when he first got elected.
Which is not much.
On both ends. So as in they're enthusiastically reading about him on the left and enthusiastically really behind him on the right. I don't think that the Florida topography has changed in that regard. Well, that being that Florida, even geographically, doesn't change its topography very much. But what was I going to say? So, what do people? A more important question to ask is, what do people in Ohio think about DeSantis? What do people in
Iowa,
New Mexico, in Arizona,
Arizona for sure.
You know what? They don't think about him. That's the they don't even think about him. That's the problem I'm seeing right now. Is that he has a very large uphill climb to make.
To be fair, we're in September. The first primaries are in February next year. So it's not like it's too late or whatever, which is one of the many reasons why I was wary on whether to even approach this topic in this episode. Because as I said to everyone else a few months ago, unless you work for the Trump or DeSantis campaign, it's really a waste of time until we get closer to the primaries, because so many things can change. We may still have a surprise candidate.
And there's a huge information blackout at the moment from within the campaigns. It's very difficult to get information compared to 2020. 2020 was much easier. 2020 was really easy. I mean, you could see the white vans coming in at 3 a.m. right in front of you, you know?
Yes. So. It also, I mean, to give a comparison, I was looking at the same moment, like August 2007. So before, at that time, Obama wasn't even in a race. Was considering joining the race, but he wasn't even in a race. And the leader, the de facto leader of the Republican PAC was Rudy Giuliani, on a very long distance to the second place, who was like someone I never heard of. And the eventual nominee that would run against Obama at first time wasn't also even in the race at that time. So, we're still way too early. So it's very difficult to opine on it. But nevertheless, it's just still astonishing that we've been 5 months since he announced his campaign to run nationally. And there doesn't seem to be much progress. Admittedly, he also did very few gaffes, so he didn't lose much. But he didn't win much. Is that intentional, or is that a competency crisis?
I don't think that's a competency crisis. I think the real... I mean, if you look at it, even the Democrats haven't been campaigning very much either. So it's just...
Yeah, because they have their own internal argument on whether they should continue to support Biden or not.
Exactly. So he can just bide his time at the moment. I honestly don't see a very good outlook for DeSantis going forward because of his name recognition. That's the only problem I can see down the road.
You think he has too much of it, or not enough?
Not enough.
Not enough. Okay.
I mean, people who pay attention to politics and hear the name DeSantis all the time. But remember, the average voter doesn't pay attention to politics. So he's just going to have a ballot in front of him.
Admittedly, he got more of a name recognition than he had hoped for during the during the so-called pandemic, right? Because the media hyped him up as a negative example, and then they'd be like, "Oops."
So the crisis of the COVID century. I think he got a lot of positive press by accident.
By accident, yeah. In an attempt to do hit pieces on him, it turned out to be oops.
But that can only go so far. I mean, you need to continue to let that snowball develop, and I don't see much coming from his camp in that particular regard. I'd like to see more. if he would be elected president, but if he would be actually really running for president, or is he? I mean, that's my question now. You know, is he actually running for president? He announced the campaign, but oh, that's nice and cute. But what are you doing?
Yeah, his supporters would say that he's doing a lot of legwork and a lot of groundwork, and to be fair, he does. But for some reason, it's not visible nationally. You'd have to go in really obscure places to see his rallies and whatever he's doing in the field in various swing districts.
When the quietest parts of the Ukrainian counteroffensive overtake the news cycle compared to you,
you're doing it wrong.
You're doing it wrong.
Fair enough. I'll just throw it there. How about the final between DeSantis and Gavin Newsom? Would that be a good thing?
Yes, it would. I think it would be more refreshing than seeing two geriatrics swinging at each other. You know, it's just sad. It's really sad. To me, the idea of Joe Biden and Trump going at it again is it's tragic.
It was fun in 2020, but not so fun now.
It was fun in 2020. It was more fun to see him go against Hillary Clinton. You know, that famous phrase, if I get elected, you'd be in jail. You know,
because you'd be in jail. Yeah. To be fair, Hillary Clinton was also a much more competent candidate, let's put it this way. And at the time, Trump had zero political baggage, which they've ended up being in his favor, even though most experts had opined that it would be the opposite.
There are still memes circulating from that debate, though. That's the thing. Like that was what,
15, 16?
No, that was 2016. So that's nearly 8 years ago. And we're still having memes circulating about that. Now that was energy right there. But you go...
there is no meme from the 2020 debates.
And imagine a debate in 2024 between the two. I mean, it's just two people in a retirement home arguing with each other.
Yeah.
It's just sad.
They would argue slower than we can produce the memes, so it would become sad. Yeah, and that's also true. Right. The People's Republic of China. Is the BRICS initiative going to de-dollarize everyone? And is this...
I'm sorry, that's not a serious question, man.
I know it's not a serious question, although unfortunately there's plenty of otherwise relatively intelligent people who actually took this bait hook, line and sinker. Just a few days ago, before I came here to Sibiu, I was briefed by an acquaintance in Cambodia telling me to be very prepared with a huge pile of $1 and $5 and $10 bills, because those are worth a lot more than the $100 bill, because, China's backyard, that would be Cambodia, actually prefers the US dollar, and the 100 yuan bill is essentially worthless. So that's how the de-dollarization is working. But on a more serious note, the whole BRICS thing, if anyone cares to use Google's function of time lapse, just news all the way till 2018, or just a very specific time frame of news. Is this the Munich flight?
Yes, it came early.
All right. The BRICS quote-unquote alliance has been issuing very optimistic press communiques for over 10 years at this point. This whole de-dollarization talk is not new. It's at least 11 or 12 years old.
Well, this time we're not listening to Russian copium, we're listening to international copium.
Yes.
Because the dollar is strong not because of the value that it has compared to other currencies. It doesn't really contend much in terms of numerical value compared to the British pound or even several other currencies. And stability, you would rather use the Swiss franc, but so this is not, people who have been speculating a lot about de-dollarization are usually Forex bros. And as long as they stick to their little Forex things, it's okay. But but once you start speculating on geopolitical implications of currencies, you're starting to get a little cringe, because the dollar is the only currency out of most international circulating currencies, including the euro, that has the capability, the proven capability, to be a reserve currency. First of all, the euro cannot be a reserve currency because it's printed by so many damn countries at the same time. It's a very good currency for, let's say, the monetary stability of particular closed markets. But particularly, you're talking about saying the health of the European market is tied very directly to the health of the euro, but you can't see the health of the Libyan market from that, but you can kind of extrapolate it from the dollar. How is the dollar performing there? Well, let's see.
Especially now after the flooding, is performing really well.
So, excuse me 1 second. To take down the dollar, you will need a similar industrial base. And considering the fact that the only industrial base that BRICS has is China, which specializes in cheap goods. Nothing wrong with that. And the fact that China really wants to control its currency as much as possible, it doesn't want to let it float very free.
And it's not even one currency, it's three.
Yeah.
It's the internally one, externally one, and the digitally one.
Yeah, so you're talking about, okay, your only industrial partner that has an industry worth a damn has a currency that is a clusterfuck. And then you have, Russia, which has the, the fucking ruble. The Argentinians, which I'm not even going to get into that. The Indians, which have, the rupee is a very good currency.
Yeah, and their industry base has been growing, but their friendship with Russia is, oh, come on, seriously?
Yeah, and you're talking about a bunch of cats trying to form a herd. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, and of the BRICS partners, they can't even agree on basic things like where is the border? Where is the Indian-Chinese border? Well, that's a disputed
and then this whole idea of, wait a second, it's the multipolar world and stuff like that. Well, the American hegemony is also multipolar.
Yes.
There's a lot of people that were sold on this idea of multipolarity, thinking that, there's the American hegemony, which is just one giant monoblock. And they keep showing these skyscrapers in skylines and saying that, look, they all look the same, but look at our country, it looks different. Well, you missed those skyscrapers that were a little bit down the street on your country. It's just, no. That's just, boomer tier selling points. It's not.
Yeah, and these days the Russian propaganda likes to use the terminology, the collective West. What that kind of analysis misses is that there's multiple poles of power within the collective West. France being one of them, although by no means the only one, yes.
Yeah, France, even you could kind of count Israel, but no, not really.
You can definitely count South Korea more recently.
Yeah.
As a separate polar of power within the collective West. So, even the collective West is not really that collective, which is why I always laugh when Russian shills use the term collective West. But BRICS is not even as close as to be integrated with each other, not even to that level. So, and by the way, the collective West doesn't have a single currency. It has three: dollar, euro, and British pound. This is three big currencies and at least four smaller ones. So there's that. But the reason I went to BRICS is to go with the segue on China, because you said, well, it's the only industrial partner in this alliance that has an industry worth a damn, and that's true. But how much
is literally worth a damn?
Yes, and that's what I was going towards. China is going through a lot of internal strife at this point. Most of that doesn't make it into the English language media, and I suppose it's because the CCP is still good enough at keeping bad news in and preventing it from going outside too much. But nevertheless, there's plenty of bad news coming in from China, and bad news for China, or to be more precise, for the CCP. Will that ever blow up, or?
I think if we are to look at the, I don't even know how to answer that. The Chinese currently have no political capacity to look outward the way that they have been selling. You know, the Silk Road Initiative, the
Belt and Road
Belt and Road Initiative, whatever, Second Silk Road, you know, and all of these other things that they've been trying to do have not necessarily been failures. I wouldn't really chalk it up that way.
But they've been far from the success that they expected.
Yeah, no. I just don't think that the people who shill for China really have much time left in their jobs. Let's put it that way. You know, the way that China operates and has operated historically, right, for thousands of years, is as a land that always looks inward, in on itself, and keeps a few tributaries here and there, you know. Like,
that's why it always implodes every century or so.
Yeah.
And never really explodes.
Yeah, and you know, it works for them, and they have very fertile land, and they can produce a lot of things, and that's wonderful and everything else, but that they can become a worldwide superpower is just a bit of a joke, and it's a joke that people actually believed in the 1980s and 90s. That they're trying to believe it today is it really beggars belief.
Why is that? I mean, why there are so many who want to believe? Because it's really a conspiracy theory at this point. It's a I want to believe kind of meme. I want to believe that China can be a superpower. Why are there so many people like that? Is it their lack of knowledge of what China really
Don't
is?
get me wrong, China can be an economical superpower. It just doesn't have the makings within it to become a political superpower. To become a political entity that can project power overseas, it's not possible.
Yeah, but even on economics, it's definitely evolving subpar. I mean, there was the panic card news in Bloomberg that the share of E1 of the global economy grows for the fifth year in a row. Okay, great. How much is it? Oh, 4.3%. It should be 10 considering the size of the China's economy. And it's not.
But it's the oldest country.
Yeah, but
it's a very old country, and new data came in 2018 that showed that they actually fudged the statistics.
Right.
It's a country that's much older than it even said it was.
Right.
You know, you don't have the productive base of people, and the one-child policy really fucked that up very badly. Because you know, try to find like that's happening right now in Shenzhen, right? You have companies that are trying to find people that can work in their factories, that can do this, that can do that, and you just don't find them. You don't find anybody
because they haven't been born.
That's between the age of 18 and 34, you know, 35 or whatever. You just don't find those people who have expertise. And if you're talking about competency crisis, that's the biggest competency crisis right there, is that most of the people who knew how to do things are dead. They're either dead or they're really old, they're retiring, you know, there's a retirement crisis happening in China.
Yeah, lucky for them, they don't have a state pension system, so it won't immediately affect the finances of the state, but it would definitely affect the economy in a way that eventually ripples on the finances of the state.
Well, it affects their ability to build, for example, aircraft carriers.
Obviously, yes.
I mean, if you want to project your power abroad, you need the aircraft carriers. You need the infrastructure to be able to produce tanks, to produce airplanes, you know, and to even have the pilots to even fly them, you know.
Yeah, because there's a lot of talk now about Taiwan.
They have a large standing army, the Chinese. They don't have a lot of people that can swim.
The PLA is one of the largest employers in the world, but so what? There's talk a lot about Taiwan these days. I want to be on the island very soon from now. And there's like, oh, but what if China invades Taiwan? And I'm like, with what amphibious force?
And their entire carrying capacity is like 80 tons of the entire amphibious assault brigade. They can't, maybe 120 tons, maybe if you're generous and you sink them, almost below the waterline. But no, you can't. War is not about the numbers that you can fudge. It's about actually walking into their equipment silos and seeing actually what equipment they have that still works. Because and that's another problem with the Chinese. They're counting equipment that they don't know if it works or not yet. But of the equipment that is guaranteed to work right now in an amphibious assault, they can only carry 120 tons overseas.
That's definitely not enough to bother Taiwan.
You can't even land in Taipei with that.
Yeah. So there's that. What's in the bag for China? I mean, you mentioned their demographic crisis, which is a very real phenomenon. Even the CCP now finally acknowledges it, and even try to mitigate it a little bit. Hu Jintao removed the one-child policy and moved it to two. And now the party strongly recommends the Chinese people to have at least 3 children. Obviously, it's not working because that's not how demographics work. The state cannot really change these things overnight.
No, demographics have a way of correcting themselves if you just leave them the fuck alone. Like it happened in this country.
Yes, but leaving them alone is just not in the DNA of the CCP.
No. It's not in the DNA of China as a whole, as a political entity throughout its history.
True.
I mean,
speaking of China's DNA as a political entity, how about their alliance with Russia? I mean, if history...
What alliance?
Yes.
But this is something that I think people misinterpreted when it was said that the Chinese friendship with Russia has no limits. It was talking about the fact that
downward limits.
Yeah, it was talking when Xi Jinping said that, right, to Putin. He was talking about the fact that the Chinese do not have any limits on what they're willing to provide. But that doesn't mean that you're actually de facto an ally. The Chinese have never been an ally of Russia throughout the entire history of both countries. When they met, the Cossack expeditions that were going into Sibir, they never ever had any kind of overarching alliance. And the Chinese are interested in China. So what does that mean? They're going to buy up, and they've been doing this. They've buy up all of the infrastructure that they can use to manufacture things in Siberia.
For a Chinese market.
For the Chinese market. And it's almost like, let's say, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. They're just moving people in and making sure that when shit hits the fan, they can actually say, hey, that's ours.
Or at the very least, hey, that belongs to this separatist movement that we may have accidentally funded or created. Because that's another aspect. China isn't really that much of a fan of straight up annexing places.
No.
But tributaries / puppet states, as we call them in modernity, yeah, sure. That's been part of the Chinese tradition for quite some time now, so it wouldn't be entirely unheard of.
Yeah, China has had throughout the last 5,000 years 4 major annexations. One by the Tang Dynasty, which was all the way into the Gobi Desert, because they wanted to just build that giant wall to protect themselves from the Huns and the hordes. And then you had the what was it? Whatever. Anyway, there was the Qing Dynasty, which annexed Lower Mongolia and things like that. But China doesn't have a policy of annexing territory. Interestingly enough, it does have a policy, though, of establishing as many tributaries as possible around it, to have buffer states. It likes the buffer zones. And China has no buffer zones between itself and Russia, except for Mongolia, which is across the Gobi Desert. But then what happens in the Manchuria region? Well, they had a war over Manchuria with Russia recently. And so you know, that's one of the things that they have in their horizon. Right?
But can the CCP be the entity that can implement any of that? I mean, will the CCP be in power?
Considering how shit Russia's army is, China's army doesn't have to be much better.
True. Fair enough. I suppose one last question. How long or how deep will be the effect on China? How deep will be the effect of the demographic crisis on China? Economically, politically, whatever.
Could take over a century to recover from that.
Which by China's standards is quite fast.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a short blink of an eye for them. No, I don't think that, there are people that are saying that China is going to split up into... Maybe it does. You know, it's done it before. It's done it before many times. I mean, there was that the guy that was a delegation that was sent to go and try to discover Rome. He got to Persia and he wanted to talk to Romans. He tried to speak Latin in Persia. They kicked him out, so they sent him over to a place a little bit further from Anatolia. And he ended up in the Middle East. And then he was like, yeah, fuck this, I'm done. And then he came back. And before he could even come back, his country was already broken up into multiple pieces. I mean, that's just a thing China does. It just implodes and...
The question is basically this. It's kind of implosion o'clock. It's pretty predictable. It's in cycles. Will China recover demographically before it implodes? Basically? No,
it won't.
Right.
The implosion might be caused by that.
Right. In which case it's going to be a lot of fireworks and it could be fun.
I don't think so. I think, I don't know, typically in those, in the more recent implosions that happened, you know, with the Ming, for example, it was just the Jin, the Jianzhou, taking the area and just eventually not necessarily annexing China, but just replacing the regime. And there could be regime change. It's a possibility I think of as much more probable than a complete, schism inside of China. I just don't think, because schisms need a lot of population. Whenever the Chinese had this giant population boom, then would follow an implosion, you know, and then the population would fall again because of the massive wars.
Yeah, but now it's already fallen, so they might not be
So
in
it's
the
just a
mood.
regime change.
Yeah.
That's what happened with the Qing dynasty. I mean,
True.
China was very depopulated under the Ming, and then they just came in and just started saying, let's pop out a bunch of kids and just keep
Yeah,
going.
it was a very civilized implosion, mostly managed bureaucratically.
Except for the small, the wars with the 8 banners.
Yes, but at
It
the
was-
scale of China, that wasn't very serious.
Yeah, it was like 20 million people or so.
Again, at the scale of China,
That's
I
tiny.
mean, let's not forget that even Mao's genocides at the scale of China of today, they're not regarded as serious as we would say they should be, but they view things definitely differently.
Yeah.
All right, we've went through the whole list in a remarkably short amount of time. Is there anything we have forgotten that maybe should be mentioned before we wrap up?
No, I mean, other than the fact that it's pronounced Kiev, motherfuckers. It's just like
And it's Severodonetsk, okay?
Severodonetsk. Yeah.
All right, then I guess that will be pretty much it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for you all being willing to spend your boredom for about 2 hours on this channel, which of course it will not be recommended by the algorithm because it doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It's full of nuance and boring shit, which of course is not fit for the current short attention span online population, but it is what it is. Что делать, нечего делать. Thanks a lot for watching. See you around. Cheers.